Hey everybody, how's everybody doing? Good. I see the thumbs up. Welcome to the last. Can you believe it? The last class. Uh, I will reemphasize what Mark said. It'd be great to hear your feedback. I got to meet Tom and Lisa a couple nights ago
Hey,
at Fishers High School, and it was great to see them there. Their daughter is involved. I think it's your daughter, correct? Involved. She's in the Fishers High School class going to the national finals in about 3 weeks. So they were doing a little scrimmage preparation for that. So nice to see you there, Tom and Lisa. Okay. I got an hour with you, a little bit less than that. I'd like to take us back to the year 1963, looking at these young faces out here. I don't see too many people that were probably alive in 1963, but I was. I was 8, going on 9, living in San Diego, California. Not that that has anything to do with tonight's presentation. But let's go back to 1963 and go to Birmingham, Alabama. Yeah, this is one of my favorite photographs of Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. I had the opportunity to meet him. He passed away a few years ago, but he was still in good health in 2002, 2003. I got to meet him in Birmingham. In fact, he spoke at our seminar on the civil rights that the Center for Civic Education put on for a number of years. I think we put on 13 of them. I think the folks, the other instructors of the course, I think they've all been to this seminar. Anyway, it had meeting him had a huge impact on me in terms of what people thought about the civil rights movement. I thought, as an educator for a long time that I knew about the civil rights movement. I didn't know much about Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, which I was quite embarrassed about. And so I sort of made I have a passion for bringing him up whenever possible, especially when you think about 1963. And why I say this is 63 is so important is this is when Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth invited Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy, Dorothy Cotton, James Bevel, and other folks who were involved in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to Birmingham. Shuttlesworth had been a co-founder of that organization, but he also co-founded or founded the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights back in 1956, excuse me. And the reason why Shuttlesworth did that is because the state legislature of Alabama that year outlawed any organization that had their headquarters outside of Alabama. Not necessarily outlawing them, but what they said is you have to turn over your list to us. So if you're a member of the NAACP in 1956 in Alabama, all of a sudden that name is going to go to the state legislature, which you can imagine people were a bit skeptical of that. So, and the reasoning was we can do this because it's an organization that's exists outside of Alabama, headquarters outside of Alabama. So what does Shuttlesworth do? He creates the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights organization in Alabama. Okay, you could take that one down for a second and go back to me. He invites King's organization to come. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King is a little bit nervous because of his experience a few years back in Albany, Georgia. It didn't work out as best as he thought it might. And one of the reasoning is that the sheriff of that town was reasonable. He actually supported sort of the effort to have a protest. But what Dr. King's organization was is they wanted some kind of confrontation, and in fact, that's what they ended up calling this event, or this movement in Birmingham, Project C, for confrontation. He asked about, well, who's the sheriff, who's in charge in Birmingham? When they said Bull Connor, he said, well, what kind of man is he? Well, he's the racist of the worst kind. And Dr. King said, well, great, because he knew he'd probably have some kind of confrontation with them. Dr. King is arrested on April 16th, then goes to jail, as the plans for the march would be the next month. He's in jail, I believe, around 11 days, but then he writes his now iconic letter from a Birmingham jail that he's smuggled out in pieces through visits from Reverend Abernathy, who came to visit, and somehow got out pieces of it on scraps of pieces of paper, and then obviously written down. This letter is iconic, I think, and there's lots of parts to it, and I don't want to spend all night on it, although I would encourage all of you to pull it up online and read it. It's written to preachers, the white preachers in Birmingham, who were sort of saying, look, take your time here, things will evolve. Don't make too much of a stink while you're here. So he's responding to this attitude about, no, this is the time. And here's why. The march starts in early May, I think May 2nd. And one of our persons who spoke at our seminar, Janice Kelsey, and you can look her up, she was sort of the classic foot soldier. And again, I think that's the folks who get left out of this big equation here, this big events, are the foot soldiers. She was a teenager at high school. She tells of the story of going to school in the morning, and then people started, when D-Day arrived, people started jumping out the windows, going out the doors, and she noticed that the teachers in general sort of turned a blind eye. They didn't try to stop them. They didn't encourage them. They just kind of said, okay. They were obviously worried that they were going to be suspended and so forth for their activities. And then they ended up going down to the 16th Street Baptist Church to where all of the demonstrations were going to, the walk was going to start from there downtown. They were told, the lesson I get out of this is they didn't just, first of all, why would you involve children in a protest like this? What about the adults? Why can't they do it? Well, it was clear, I think, to Dr. Martin Luther King and Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and Reverend Abernathy and James Bevel and others, that if adults were involved, they would likely be fired and lose economic stability and so forth. So what about the children? And I really believe that this is one of the most difficult decisions in American history. I mean, I think obviously dropping the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a tough decision to make. I think the decision by General Robert E. Lee not to head up the Union troops because he can't fire on Virginia, his home state, a tough decision to make. This one certainly is too. When James Bevel brought up, what about the kids? Why don't we involve the children in this? Well, you can see where this might go really bad. And so they actually had classes for these kids. They had, citizenship education, some kind of little course like we're doing right now. This wasn't about raising the level of the kids' tempers. it was about telling them that there is something called the First Amendment and your right to protest and so forth. And this is a part of the Constitution, not necessarily against the Constitution. They weren't just sent out without any sort of, they were told that tell the police if you're arrested that you're 14, even if you're not, so that you can be treated like a child. Bring whatever you need to stay over a night in jail or whatever. And when you leave this church, when you leave the 16th Street Baptist Church, all you can do, and when people or the police or whoever, they didn't know who in the beginning, if they call you names, throw rocks at you or whatever, all you can respond is singing, praying, and then go to jail. If you can't do this non-violently, please don't be a part of it. Can you take it in a sense? Well, the kids leave in groups of 50, all right, from the church. This is right downtown, right across from the Kelly Ingram Park. If you've never been there, it's a place to go to see American history right up front. You see how far they walked. Then all of a sudden, they're arrested. And Janice Kelsey was in the first group, and she's arrested. Consequently, in the next few days, they arrest thousands of kids, all right? They fill the jail, and they can't hold them all there, so they take them to the amusement park, which Janice says was interesting because they weren't allowed to go there because they're an African American, and now here they are, they get to go to the amusement park, but they're being incarcerated there for a few days while their parents are outside handing sandwiches through the fences and so forth. She said the dogs didn't come out to the second day, and the water hoses. This is when Bull Connor brings out his infamous white tank that shoots a hose of water hard enough to, witnesses said, to take skin off and certainly hair off and not clothes off. And you can see, obviously, all you have to do is Google the iconic images of all of this. This goes on. What's interesting to me is that the press, Doug Jones was a part of our seminar. He's now Senator Jones from Alabama. He says when he was a kid, because he's my age, that they didn't really hear about this in the suburbs of Birmingham, but the world news heard about it. And when businessmen from Birmingham who happened to be in Japan discussing trade possibilities for Birmingham saw this on the world news, they got on planes and came back to Birmingham. And then now, Mark, would you go to that photograph of King and Abernathy and Shuttlesworth? Yeah, make it smaller.
Okay.
Yeah, this is another one of my favorite photographs from this era. This is Dr. King and Reverend Abernathy and Reverend Shuttlesworth in the middle, sitting down with a press conference, discussing changes to Birmingham policy. One of a great primary document, and I wish I now would have had it on there for you, but you can look it up, were the laws in Alabama, race laws. For example, a white man and a black man can't be in a public park playing chess or checkers together. Things that seem just ridiculous to us today. They broke these down. This is the beginning again, I guess, to the wedges in the wall of segregation are being broken down at this point. And this is in May of 1963. August of 63, King leaves Birmingham. Next big event is the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, August 28, 63. Notice that there are 10 speakers. And look at number 6. That's John Lewis, the Representative John Lewis, now from Georgia. He was 23 at the time. He pointed out when he spoke at the Birmingham seminar that the Center for Civic Education put on a few years ago. By the way, you do not want to follow John Lewis when you speak. The guy, tremendous and very uplifting. And he says that he's the only person alive left on this list of speakers. Certainly because of his age at 23. Okay, it's August. What Fred Shuttlesworth had done is sue the state of Alabama because, and this is 9 years after Brown, right? After Brown versus the Board of Education, because his kids, to integrate the schools with his children. There's a iconic video of him taking his kids to school and being beaten up, hit with chains, and as soon as he gets out of the car, he's attacked by members of the KKK and other white supremacists who are living there. They can't stand the fact or don't want kids, white or black kids, to integrate into white schools, even in 1963, okay? His lawsuit, he wins it in September or in August or right around September, all right? Which then, in September, what occurs in 1963 is the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church with 4 young girls being killed in the girls' restroom prior to the service. Doug Jones, who talks about this, who prosecuted these bombers 40 years later, Senator Jones, says that the KKK saw their world crumbling with this court case. Their world was going away and they couldn't stand it. Their reaction, bomb a church and kill 4 young girls in the process of it. A few years ago, well, a number of years ago, I had an interesting call from Sarah Mae Collins, or Sarah Collins Rudolph, excuse me. And she said, do you know who I am? And I said, yeah, I do. You're the sister who survived the bombing. And she'd married a Rudolph, and that's how she became Sarah Collins Rudolph. And she said to me that Donzale Abernathy, the daughter of Ralph Abernathy, had told her that she should speak at the Birmingham seminar. Now, she's been quiet for all these years, and she's been lost in history too, because unfortunately, with all due respect to the 4 young girls who lost their lives, that's who we talk about. We don't talk about her. And she wanted a chance to talk about her experience. And I said, absolutely. And so she came to the seminar, and she's walking across the street from the Kelleringham Park, and the church is on her right side, and she hadn't seen it or been to it since the bombing, and was sort of freaked because she's walking into the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, which is just across the street from Kelleringham Park and also the 16th Street Baptist Church. She starts off where she's got these papers and she's sort of rattling through it, all of that, and then she puts them down and talks about the episode. She remembers tying her sister's sash, and then nothing, gone. And she lost an eye and all of that. She, later on, she talked about how she became addicted to drugs, but that her present husband helped her with that. And, she's trying to live her life since that bombing. She's since then talked out a little bit more about it as well. Another person I think we shouldn't lose in all of this when we celebrate, in my mind, celebrate the civil rights movement, because what we're talking about here is young people under the guidance of African-American preachers with a movement that changed America for the better, it seems to me. Let the world know what was going on in Birmingham, and things have changed, certainly. It's a trip to the 16th Street Baptist Church is all important, I think, in our, for us to see that, to understand that this was children trying to get their liberty. Because if you remember the first night when I talked about the mechanisms that Madison put together in his structure of government, and I talked about learned hand, and it has to be in our hearts and our minds. But what happens when government is the problem? Then people have to take it to the streets. And what I admire about the civil rights movement in Birmingham in particular is that it was underpinned by the First Amendment. It was underpinned by the Constitution and by the Bill of Rights, in a way of saying, again, like Dr. King might say, just let us in, let's be a part of we the people. And we should celebrate it that way, it seems to me. And so, for today, it seems to me that young people who are upset about things going on in our society, and not so young people being upset, is take a lesson from the kind of thinking that underpinned this movement of young children and this Project C for confrontation in Birmingham. Shuttlesworth's house was bombed on Christmas Eve, 1956. 16 sticks of dynamite under his house, which was connected to his church, Bethel Baptist, which has just recently been renovated. It looks beautiful like it used to be. He survived that, right? This was in a neighborhood. So people were out on the street and they saw him walk out of this blown up house and said, he's alive. They couldn't believe it. And Shuttlesworth, said to us that, at that point, the Blues Brothers make a fun of this, which is a great movie, by the way. But he's on a mission from God, and he truly is at this point. If this bomb can't kill me, then I've got to, nothing can kill me. And so he took that as his cause. He said in an interview, I was talking to him, a long time ago, and he said, I really like Birmingham, although he moved away in the 60s, was because a lot of my blood is on the street here. And he took pride in that, of being out there. Like when he brought his kids to school, he told everybody he was going to do it, and he took the pain when the white supremacists who ran into him, beat the crap out of him. But that's the kind of guy he was, in a sense. He was, a fighter with that. So this year, 1963, ends with this bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, and changes everything. And I have an interview on, when you go to Learn Serve, you can click on that interview with Doug Jones. He's an American hero to me. I mean, he was in the right place at the right time, he will tell you, but he prosecuted these guys 40 years afterwards and put them in jail. His catchphrase with that is justice delayed, justice denied. And he didn't think that way. It took 40 years to put these guys in prison, but they did go to prison, and they died in prison. So there was some justice there, if you will, in that. Now, speaking of justice, now I'd like to go to the group, to our breakout groups. I want you to look at or read together this paragraph from the letter from a Birmingham jail by Dr. King. And it's just one piece, and it talks about law and different kinds of law, just versus unjust, and what we should do about it. I'd like you to critique it. Does it make sense to you? Is this a way to talk about justice that makes sense or not? Does he have it wrong? In terms of civil disobedience. And so it's only a paragraph. Let's do 10 minutes. So it's 7:30 now, pretty much. So let's come back at 7:40 or so. And then I'd love to hear your impressions about this piece that was written in 1963 from jail. I really like to hear from the different groups now for a couple minutes on what your thoughts are.
Okay, so group one was Shane's group. Let's see, Shane, I'm trying to find you down here.
I got it, Mark.
Okay, good.
Asia, are you willing to talk about from our group? I don't know if she hears me.
Let's see.
I'm sorry, I had to unmute.
That's okay. Are you willing to share? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, we identified a variety of different concepts inherent in the multiple paragraphs that we looked at. We looked at the very last paragraph and the second to last paragraph. In the last paragraph, we touched on natural law and how it evoked notions of the Declaration of Independence and what the founders were talking about in terms of natural law. And then the second to last paragraph, we looked at the idea of the sameness and difference. And we talked about power dynamics. We talked about the rule of law. And we touched on, I think that's primarily it, right? If anyone else wants to jump in.
Yeah, I think the only other thing was the part about the idea of the way that power creates laws that degrade and damage others. And so that was a nice, your use of the word power is a really nice, succinct way to sort of express that idea.
Yes, thank you.
All right. So Tom, your group was next, group two.
Yeah, we talked about how the letter and really the civil rights movement itself really represents perhaps the best example in our nation's history of using the ideas and principles of our Constitution and system of government and working within the system, even though they were practicing civil disobedience. And King's letter is an outstanding articulation of why it was necessary. I mean, he wrote it to those other white clergy, but really it's become a lesson for all of us that there does come a time when a problem that really focuses on injustice. When an injustice is happening, and it's been happening for a long time, and you've tried what you can to work within the system as best you can. By the way, that's a part of the letter, and that doesn't work. There does come a time where, as Bob says, you got to take it to the streets. And but you got to take it to the streets in the right way, and the right way was civil disobedience, intentionally breaking a law to cast light on some injustice. And so for our group, we think that this is just an outstanding example of that kind of citizenship. And it wasn't just King, right? As Bob pointed out, it was King plus all of the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworths around, plus, most importantly, the middle and high school kids that had been educated about these ideas and how our system of government was not living up to its ideals. We also were reminded by one of our group members that King, as great as he was and as good as the letter from the Birmingham jail is, wasn't the first to practice civil disobedience. And in fact, King was a student of Gandhi, who also, as we all know, practiced civil disobedience, as did Socrates and lots of other people. But a great articulation of our values, ideas, and principles, and how we can work within the system to promote positive social change.
All right, thanks for that, Tom. Okay, group 3, that's Chris, your group.
Okay, got me, thanks.
Yeah,
We read the entire thing, actually, Robbie did, and he shared with us the fact that, such a great argument laid out by King, not necessarily an argument, but an explanation of when it's okay to break the law, and why it's okay to break the law. And we talked about how it went from the philosophical to the real, so we talk about, a just law lifts people up and unjust law keeps people down. But he also talked about what's going on in Alabama, where, white folks pass laws, African Americans don't have a voice, and that white folks are, not having to follow their own law. I talked about, and I like to share with my students, I like to go back to the Declaration of Independence and, use Jefferson's words that we don't do this for light or transient causes. There's been a long train of abuses and usurpations. This is why we were rebelling, right? And so when you look at the civil rights movement, is the right to revolution, John Locke's right to revolution, is a one and done. The idea is that this only gets to go for the old revolutionary guys, but when you're a Malcolm X, does that mean you don't have the right to revolution? Because clearly, right? If you think about his any means necessary speech, where he says, when you live in a land that's based upon law and they refuse to enforce the law because the color of a man's skin is wrong, then I say you're justified in using any means necessary to bring about change. How is that different than Jefferson? So to think about that, because I think you could show a long train of abuses and usurpations. And Tara Lisa made sure we made that we got the word lovingly in there, that when you break this law, you break it openly, knowingly, and lovingly.
That's right.
This is a very powerful message that you're going to openly, knowingly and lovingly break the law, which is a very, very powerful message. So, again, this is just an incredible document for all people to read. So I just took it upon myself to be spokesperson for the group. So,
Hey, Chris.
Yeah.
Thank you for mentioning Malcolm X. I have in the past, and I didn't think I had time tonight. But it's a great contrast to look at his famous the ballot or the bullet.
Yes.
In terms of his ideas about civil disobedience, basically saying, you slap me, I'm not going to turn the cheek. I'm going to slap you back.
Right. Exactly.
And so how King's ideas morphed or changed from other people's perspective. And one that stands out, obviously, is Malcolm X. And so I suggest, Google that letter, that speech that he spoke, and contrast that with King's document.
Yes.
There was another group, Mark?
Yeah, group 4, that would be Tim. Tim, your group. I unmuted you.
Yeah, perhaps for better or worse, in our group, we spent most of our time thinking about the difficulties of defining a moral consensus. With somebody else, Ryan, you want to chime in and do some summary of our discussions?
Let's see.
Oh, okie doke. Yeah, so when we looked at morality and the difficulty with achieving moral consensus, the idea being that, maybe morals change over time, the way that people are going to approach things and trying to get a standard and show, how, where what might be perceived, like again with Jefferson, these are moral truths, and over time, they shift, and we view some of those things as immoral. And then the other thing that we talked quite a bit about was in the last paragraph, the mention of conscience. And when looking especially at that last line, the conscience of the community, I submit that an individual who breaks the law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse conscience of the community over its injustices. We were basically saying that's, a thing where what is my conscience might be different from someone else's. And again, where we're trying to achieve that communal conscience, that's going to be a difficult thing to do. And again, you're going to see different standards in different communities.
All right, that's all for the groups. Bob, thank you, Ryan, for sharing that.
Okay, well, we just have a few minutes left for my part, and we're going to take a break, and then we'll get to Tom Vontz for the last hour. I guess I would just sort of end this with we need to remember American history. I think in one sense, and I'll reiterate what Tommy said was, I think this is the best example in American history of people, like I like to say, taking it to the streets to get their freedom. And I also love what was brought up about, in a loving way, because I think Shuttlesworth and King and Abernathy would all say that the Civil Rights Movement was about love, not hate. Being a part of the whole we the people aspect of this. I think Peg is still here. She's a colleague of mine who's been involved in a number of the Constitution 101s that I've done in Fort Wayne. She is a member of Women's League of Women Voters. And since this session is sort of on, being a participant in our democracy, however we do that, voting is not the only way to do it. Peg, would you like to do a plug for the league?
Oops, you're unmuted.
Okay. I forgot you mentioned you were going to ask me to do this.
Yes, but Peg, I know you can talk at any time you want. So.
Okay. I'm unmuted now, and I literally forgot that you said you were going to ask me to do this. So, but I would be happy to put in a plug for the League. The League of Women Voters came from the suffragette movement, as a matter of fact, and we were one of the groups that developed as a result of the right to vote, and that's the history in a nutshell. We do a lot of advocating for voter rights, but our primary emphasis is to educate, civic education basically, so it kind of coincides and goes along with the Constitution 101 class very well, which is why we're one of the co-sponsors of the adult class here in Fort Wayne. There are local groups, and there's a national group, of course, and you can just Google the League of Women Voters and get to the national website, but you can also check, we have a state, Indiana, I'm from Indiana, so we have an Indiana State League of Women Voters. We have a Fort Wayne one, so depending on where you're located, I would encourage you to get involved with your local organization. Some of you may remember the League of Women Voters sponsored many of the candidate forums in the past, and we continue to do that in not as much on the national level, but at the local and state levels. So depending on where you live, you may have an opportunity to listen to candidate forums in different elections that will be sponsored by the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters also provides candidate information, all kinds of voter information. I have personally been quite involved with redistricting reform. And if any of you are following redistricting reform, you'll note that the Supreme Court listened to or heard arguments for a Maryland case and the North Carolina case, both against partisan redistricting. And the League and Common Cause and a number of other groups were plaintiffs in that case. So that's an interesting thing to check too. There's a lot of information online. So I'm just going to put in my plug. We accept men as well as women. So I would encourage all of you to consider joining the League of Women Voters. I hope sometime we're going to change the name because it's kind of a misnomer at this point and we wind up with mostly women, but we do admit men. Please think about getting involved. We need all the help we can get, especially in the current political climate, to protect voter rights, to protect constitutionality, and make sure that there is equal access for all. So that's my spiel. Thank you.
Thanks, Peg. I saw a chat. Was that from you, Timmy?
It may have been, yeah.
Yeah. He wants me to leave you with this quote from Shuttlesworth, and this will tell you a lot about the man, I think. This was during a teacher seminar, and one of the teachers there, I think was it Dave Richmond?
Yes. Yeah.
Said, well, Reverend Shuttlesworth, you've been talking a lot about the role of the church. What about the role of the Constitution in all of this? And Shuttlesworth looked out and said to us, and I'm just going to quote him, all right? He said, "The Constitution ain't shit if Jesus is not in your heart." I apologize, but we've debated about whether I should repeat that or not. But this is Reverend Shuttlesworth. That's what he said, and I think it's kind of that's sort of a contrast to what Learned Hand would say in a way that Reverend Shuttlesworth was not afraid to talk about, to say that this document is sort of worthless unless you've got Jesus in your heart. And you want to end this injustice that is occurring then, and some would argue today, in different facets and so forth. So, with that quote, I'll leave you. We can take a break, and then come back at about 5,
All right.
and then we'll hear from Professor Vontz.
Okay, we'll see everybody in 5 minutes.
Our cleanup hitter for Constitution 101 is Dr. Tom Vontz from Kansas State University. We've known each other many, many years. We both have the same mentor professor from Indiana University, John Patrick. Tommy's a lot smarter than I am, but that's okay. But I know he's been waiting to give his presentation, and he's got this fancy PowerPoint, it looks like here. So without any further ado, Tommy, take it over.
Well, thanks, Bob. You might ask why I have the background of that looks like cameras. And the only response I have to that is it's the only background that I could find easily. So I'm not going to be as fancy as Tim Moore and use parchment paper or something like that. But then again, I don't have a black eye. So I think I'm safe here. Let me start before we're going to do about 45 or 50 minutes, and we're going to save some time at the end for comments and questions and that kind of thing. Before I dive into anything, let me just say that we didn't know how this was going to go. Leming called me, we're very close friends, and asked me what I thought, whether or not Constitution 101 could go online, and we didn't know, frankly, and it's a credit to Bob Leming and how he's always willing to take a risk for the purpose of educating citizens about the Constitution. And while this hasn't been perfect and we're anxious to hear your feedback and so forth, I got to tell you, from my perspective, I've enjoyed every session. And I've been doing this stuff for a long time, and I've learned something every session. And I've learned from my colleagues, and it's just stimulating, not only being around my colleagues as co-presenters, but more importantly, being around 20 or so other people who think that this stuff is important enough to show up for 2 hours on a Tuesday night every week. And so I'm just delighted that that you were a part of this first experiment, and hopefully you'll think that it's something that we could try again. And if nothing else, I guess just the 5 or 6 presenters, we can just get together and hash out Constitution ideas every couple weeks. But in the big scheme of things, you have to ask yourself this question, as do our kids. Why the hell does this stuff matter anyway? Okay, if Bob can say S-H-I-T, I can go with hell. All right, why does this matter anyway? And it's the question, frankly, that our students, many of you are high school teachers or middle school teachers or whatever, and it's the $100,000 question they ask us as well. And I'm going to try in the next 45 minutes to provide an answer to that question. And we're not going to break out into any breakout groups this time. We're not going to leave this PowerPoint. And if you're wondering why, it's because I have a flip phone and I don't want to mess with the technology, but it won't be death by PowerPoint, I promise. There will be opportunities for you to interact as a whole class, either on chat or verbally or through Zoom. So let's dive into this. We're gonna start this last session where we began. I think it's completely appropriate, especially considering what we just the last hour with Professor Leming. I've used this quote for a number of years, and I think that this quote speaks volumes about our system of government. And my interpretation of this quote is that, hey, we can't just let the courts and our laws and our government decide what's best for us. But there's also a component of all this called political culture. And as Bob said the first night, it has to not only be in our minds, but also in our hearts. And I believe that. And when we talk about issues, when we have disagreements as citizens, we should begin with the idea that we agree on certain fundamental principles. We might disagree in their application. We might disagree about which ones to stress at what times and apply to what issues. But I think that we would be better off, and right now we're living in an age of polarization, not the first time that that's ever happened in our country. We will come out the other end of this age of polarization. We'll probably come out a little bit differently, but trust me, we will come out the other side of this eventually. And I think I'm going to mention a name here, Kermit Hall. Used to be a speaker at our We the People Institutes, one of the great American legal historians in our nation's history. And he wrote a book years ago that I still have called The Magic Mirror. And the main thesis of the book is our laws, our Constitution, our system influences us as a culture, but like a magic mirror, our culture, us, we the people, also influence our government. I think really what Learned Hand is saying here is that these ideas don't matter very much unless there is a widespread understanding of those ideas in our society, and people are willing not only to know and understand them, but as Bob said, live them. So I wanted to start where this last session where we began with all the sessions. This is the first time that I've ever showed this slide to a group of people. In fact, I just made this slide. This slide is less than 48 hours old. And I thought to myself, you know, if really what We the People is about and what our role as teachers is about is to help people think constitutionally, what does that really mean? And so I didn't get this from anywhere. Timmy, if one of the founders said this the same thing, it's merely by accident, and maybe I should have been born a couple hundred years earlier. But in my mind, constitutional thinking is using the ideas, principles, and values of the Constitution to perceive what's going on out there, whether it's interpreting something on the news or reading a newspaper or a conversation with a friend, to frame, how am I going to frame an issue or some problem in our society, analyze, think through, and ultimately judge our political landscapes. And again, this doesn't necessarily only happen at the highest levels. It doesn't have to be an elected official that's doing this, but rather I think Bob's last session showed that it needs to happen among the citizenry. And in point of fact, you know, there are other people that have said this. I mentioned the name Walter Murphy, who Timmy reports died a couple of years ago or a few years ago, but a great constitutional scholar. And he said in several different places in his writing that we should not just turn over the responsibility of constitutional interpretation to the courts, but rather all systems of government, all levels of government, and the citizenry itself should be interpreters of the Constitution. Constitutional thinking is not just understanding what constitutional law says, however. It's understanding, and I think that you'll find evidence of all of these perspectives throughout the last 6 weeks. All of these perspectives are certainly in the We the People program, right? Unit 1 has a heavy emphasis on philosophy and the origins of the ideas that are a part of our Constitution and system of government. Certainly the whole book, the whole enterprise of We the People, and the last 6 weeks, we've traced some historical perspectives on these ideas, how they've developed over time. These ideas do not just sit in one spot, rather they are buoys that move around. And we're constantly attempting to redefine them for our own circumstances. Certainly, legal perspectives play into it. Bob and I certainly like to analyze Supreme Court decisions, and they involve real people, and oftentimes, you know, set the endpoints for our rights, at least for that moment in time. And then we've also utilized over the last 6 weeks practical perspectives. You know, what would be the practical implications of whether we went through door X or door Y as a government or as a citizenry. I've been doing this for a long time, folks. I taught civics and government, and I can't think of a better program, honestly, or a better way of approaching our ideas, values, and principles than in We the People. And again, it's not like shoving a particular ideology down a student's throat. Rather, we do say we're beginning with our first principles. we're beginning with the things that we agreed on in the founding and how we have come to know those things today. So we began not, a blank slate, but we began just like Dr. Martin Luther King and Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and all those kids did. We begin with our own values and principles, and we say, how can we make this whole thing better? I have to say, and some of my colleagues might disagree, but again, especially in this age of polarization, that really most scholars of democratic theory have, including all the way back to Aristotle, have said that really good governance, good citizenship avoids extremes and finds some middle path, middle way. And really, if you think about it, I've tried to, on this slide, list some things that really focus on liberalism or the individual, right? And we certainly do that in our system of government. But if we take that idea to an extreme, that's bad. And on the other side, we also live in a system of government that has respect for the common good and civic virtue and the nation as a whole. And most of the time, I think, when we're dealing with real issues today, I can't think of an issue, and you can challenge me on this at the very end, that you can't throw into this kind of framework, right? Whether it's the debate about the individual mandate in Obamacare, or whether or not we should build a wall, or whatever the case may be, you can help students and help other citizens frame those issues with ideas that come from our Constitution and system of government. You know, we used to talk about the sensible center, the moderate middle, as being kind of the sweet spots for politicians in the United States. And historically, that's been true. But at least in the recent past, politicians have been even more popular by going to extremes. And I'm giving you Tommy's 2 cents on this, and you don't have to agree with me. I'm an old social studies teacher. I like disagreement, but I tend to agree with Aristotle and the moderate middle. So what are those core concepts? Bob has a list, gave you a list at the beginning. My list is a little different, although it comes from the same source. John Patrick was the primary author of Bob's list in the beginning. He was also the primary author of this list, only we added 7 other experts to John Patrick to debate and analyze what are the really core concepts. I like thinking about these core concepts because they just pop up all of the time when we're thinking about governance and citizenship. I like thinking about these core concepts too, because 5 is a nice number to get your head around. Sometimes when people first start learning about the Constitution and our system of government, they think it's too complex, they can't possibly learn and understand it all. But if you say, hey, if you know these 5 concepts and related concepts really well, know where they came from, know how they developed, know what they mean today, then really you're on top of your citizenship game. There are several slides here, and I'm not going to go through them all. I'm just going to let you see them, but you'll have access to this PowerPoint just because I want you all to have, Tom's version of what these core ideas mean. So, and this wasn't just Tom's version, this was John Patrick's version with the help of 7 other experts. We actually did a Delphi process on coming up with this list. But it's a nice list of, how we define these core concepts. And I think that after this is over and you're going through the PowerPoint, this PowerPoint, you'll see evidence of all of these things throughout the 6 weeks that we've been together, whether it is a historical perspective that Timmy provided, or a more developmental approach that Shane or Chris or Bob have provided, or tonight with looking at something that's current and relevant today. Citizenship has come up in our conversations over the last 6 weeks. Who's in the club? How do we decide who's in the club? Who should we let in and why? And of course, this is a big issue with regard to immigration and how do we set immigration policy? Not only that, but then, you know, once you're in the club, what does that mean? And by the way, Bob and I have traveled throughout the world, and I think one of the things that we got right at the founding, we got several things right, we got some things wrong too, but one of the things that we got right was that we said that you're a citizen in general, and again, I know at the founding that not everyone was a citizen and so forth, but not by virtue of where you came from or your religious beliefs or whatever, but by virtue of being committed to a central set of ideas and values. And that's basically our conception of citizenship today, right? We're not citizens because of where we came from or a language or even 2,000 years of history, but rather we're citizens because we say we agree on these ideas, values, and principles. Human rights has been a big part of the last 6 weeks. What are they? How do we define them? How have they changed over time? Bob's session on privacy, right? And the Fourth Amendment. Obviously, technology has caused us to rethink what privacy means in the current context. What we didn't really have a chance to get to as much is, if you look at economic and social rights, many constitutions around the world now protect economic and social rights. We've chosen not to do that. We have those things, and I'll argue with anyone who wants to, technically speaking, we don't have a right to an education. The Supreme Court's never found a fundamental right to an education. And if you want to argue with me about that later, we can, but it's moot because they've never done it. But so we talked a little bit about positive and negative rights as well. And we've been people in a constitution that's primarily protected negative rights. Stuff the government can't do to you, take away free speech, for example. We've also talked a little bit about popular sovereignty and the people as the source of authority and consent of the governed, and how that's kind of a complicated topic because while the people are ultimately in power, we also don't fully trust the people, and we put things in our Constitution and in our system of government that shows that distrust. And one thing that we haven't talked about as much, but is certainly a part of our system of government, maybe we talked about gerrymandering a little bit, but what constitutes free, fair, competitive, regularly scheduled elections? And you'd like to think that in the United States, well, we have that down to a science at this point, but we're still arguing about what constitutes equality in terms of voting and electoral democracy. Civil society, you know, Bob in his last presentation pointed out that it wasn't just Dr. King acting alone or Reverend Shuttlesworth acting alone, but it was them in concert with civil society organizations, the NAACP or whatever the case may be. And in a free society, having freely formed organizations independent of the government is really an important deal. We tend to take it for granted in the United States, but one of the first things the Soviet Union did was outlaw civil society. And to be effective in either helping the government or in checking the government when it's gone astray, we need a vibrant civil society, whether that's the Red Cross or the League of Women Voters that we just heard about, or Boy Scouts, or even the church, right? We talked a little bit in the last session about the role of the Black church in the civil rights movement. So civil society is very important. So all of these ideas and constitutional thinking raise what I call perennial questions, questions that are with us, have been with us from the founding, are still with us today, and we still grapple with them as citizens. How do we best provide, divide, separate, and limit power? That probably is the most critical question of American governance and citizenship. And on down the line it goes. I'll let you read those for yourself. I do want to have plenty of time to get to a practical example. So I'm going to stop there. But by the way, if I don't say so myself, that's a pretty good list of questions. And so, you know, you could probably throw in a few others, but in terms of questions that are constantly with us, that's not bad. So we get to a practical example. It's not only a practical example of how these ideas matter, not only a practical example in how these ideas matter in a big sense, but a primary example of how these ideas might matter in a local sense, right? Sometimes our students think that, you know, all of this is just, you know, for the president, the Supreme Court, and elected officials. That's not true at all. I've come in contact with constitutional issues in my own life many times, and this is one. Wamego is where I'm talking to you from right now. It's my little town, a town of about 5,000 people out here on the plains. Well, not long ago, a couple years ago, the school board, actually the entire school administration, wanted to initiate a policy of random drug testing at our public school here in Wamego, Kansas. And so there's the policy. It is there word for word. I pulled it from the student handbook. And there are the punishments for a violation of the random drug policy. And so basically, CASHA is any activity sponsored by the school. So if you're in band, if you're you know, in a club, if you're in FFA, which is big out here, Future Farmers of America, or anything like that. And of course, the vast majority of our kids are in clubs and athletic activities and band and so forth. And so this hits probably 80% of the student body in grades 8 through 12. And so to participate, they have to, they're forced to, their parents are forced to sign a form saying that they'll subject their son or daughter to random drug testing so that they can participate. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. And I want you to pretend as if you are a member of the school board, and I want you to vote this policy thumbs up or thumbs down on chat. And I'll pull chat up here if I can see it. I don't see where chat is, but somebody can tell me what the chat is. Vote up or down. Before we do, are there any questions about this policy? As a school board member, you have the right to ask a question. Do you have any questions about it? Just unmute yourself and ask. Okay, no questions. School board, you must vote now. Yes or no? Yes or no? Do you want to pass this random drug testing, or do you want to vote it down? It looks like we have a majority saying no, but we do have a few yeses. I'll let you know that our school board passed it. There was one dissenting vote. School board member Johnson voted against it, and but it passed 6-1 or something like that. And so now, using constitutional thinking, if you were against it or for it, what might you say? I saw in the comments somebody said, well, there's a Supreme Court decision that says that you can do this. Well, I think that the first thing that you would do, whether you were for or against it, you would say to yourself, well, gee, what part of the Constitution does this really affect? And the most obvious answer is the Fourth Amendment. And we know from Bob's excellent presentation on the Fourth Amendment, we know some things about the Fourth Amendment. We know about New Jersey versus TLO, and we know that, well, school's a different place. It doesn't require probable cause, it just requires reasonable suspicion. And after all, aren't these athletes and band members and high school students in general, aren't we reasonably suspicious of their behavior? But wait, a constitutionally minded person might say, we know from the history of the Fourth Amendment that they wanted particularity when the government was going to search someone. Does we use hair testing here. Does hair testing really constitute a search? Is taking someone's hair and exposing it to chemicals and so forth to see what kinds of drugs they've been doing, is it? Well, those are open questions. Vernonia School District versus Acton in 1995. The problem was steroid use among mostly football players, and the court had to weigh the students' privacy interests versus the school's interest in providing a safe environment. And they said, well, you know, gee, steroid use is kind of a problem. And so we'll allow you to drug test those student athletes. And that's what Acton said. And then move up a couple years and we get to Chandler versus Miller, where there's a Georgia law that says that all candidates for public office must expose themselves to random drug testing. And in that case, the court was again weighing and trying to balance individual rights and of the candidates and their privacy issues with the state's interest in having drug-free politicians and elected officials. And in that case, they said, no, the Georgia law was unconstitutional. The state did not meet the burden of showing that there was a really compelling interest for this, overriding the candidate's privacy interest. Then probably the case that most directly deals with this particular random drug testing issue in Wamego or anywhere throughout the United States is Board of Education versus Earls in 2002. Now it's not just for athletes, but anyone involved in extracurriculars can be tested. And that's obviously what they were using here in Wamego. But I want you to notice that it was a close case in the Supreme Court. It was a 5-4 decision. There were lots of people, including Sandra Day O'Connor, which is a great quote right there, that did not agree with the majority opinion in this case. Basically saying that, there are safety concerns for athletes and so forth, but she's not as concerned that stone tuba players might run into each other at band practice. And so there wasn't as much of a school safety concern as there would be for athletics. So yes, what they did was constitutional, but is it all the way constitutional, and is it wise? I like to point out that just because the Supreme Court has spoken on something, thank goodness, doesn't mean that we can't disagree with them, right? I mean, shoot, the pro-life movement every year, I don't know how many thousands of people march on the Supreme Court on the anniversary of Roe versus Wade, for example. thank goodness, after Plessy versus Ferguson, Thurgood Marshall and everyone else didn't just say, well, I guess that's the law, we're going to have to go on with it. No, they fought to overturn it. And not only that, but in about 14 states, random drug testing has been successfully challenged on state constitutional grounds, right? We don't just have a national constitution, we also have state constitutions. And state constitutions are supreme law in that state. So we have a couple different constitutions to which we might appeal if we're unhappy as citizens. So is random drug testing a wise policy? It may be constitutional, it is constitutional, at least right now, but lots of things are constitutional but still stupid, right? It's constitutional to poke yourself in the eye, I used to tell my students, but it's not wise. I wouldn't suggest it. Eventually, your eye will hurt. You'll look like Tim Moore. It's lots, just because something's constitutional doesn't make it right, just, or good. In fact, even the court's ruling in Earls, in the majority opinion, said, well, we say that this is constitutional. We are silent as to whether or not it's wise for a school to adopt this policy. It's a quote from Earls. So we should continue to debate, even after something's been passed. And in fact, we have a website here in Wamego that a citizen, after this was passed, put up. It's called, and you can go to it if you want to after this. It's called stayoutofourhair.com. And it's, in essence, a website against random drug testing here in Wamego. So what's really at stake? As I mentioned, it's not only the student's privacy right. In my estimation, and again, we're all adults, you can disagree with me, it's also a family privacy issue. And one of the arguments that I tried to make, I was against it, but one of the arguments I tried to make is, it shouldn't be the school that gets to decide the best way to educate my kids on drug and alcohol abuse. That should be primarily my responsibility as a father, or our responsibility as father and mother. So you have student and family privacy on one side, but then you have on the other side real interest. The school has a real interest in solving a drug problem. You might ask, well, how big's the drug problem at Wamego? Well, comparatively speaking, it's not big, right? I mean, the latest survey that they did, 17% of Wamego high school kids said that they had used marijuana in the last 30 days. I'm a little older, I'm 53 years old, but I guarantee you if that survey would have been passed out at my high school during the early 80s, the number would have been much higher, probably 90% or so. Anyway, I want you to, let's unmute yourselves this time, and I'd like to hear at least one person from both sides, and then we just have a couple more things to do. So where do you stand? And it could be anybody. Where do you stand on this random drug testing policy in a public school, and why are you standing there?
I'll jump in, Tom, because I was a coach for over a quarter of a century, and I was the one that promoted the idea at our school where I used to teach of instituting random drug testing when we didn't have it. And I was told that the reason we don't is because of what you said is a parental decision. And I doubt you find a bigger civil libertarian at our school than me. But my point was that we need to give our athletes a reason to say no. I'm channeling my inner Nancy Reagan there. But we had some issues back in the day, and we had a lot of kids partying, and we didn't, we wanted our kids to be safe. And I was told that we don't do this. And so we eventually, guess what we did? We instituted a random drug testing policy for anybody, very similar to Ossego's. If you're, or what's the name of your
Wamego.
Wamego, my bad. That if you do anything at school right? I mean, prom, dance, any activities, show choir, anything, you have to sign a consent. You go in the pool for testing, right? But as I said a couple times on the chat, as our policy was set up, it's not punitive. The policy set up at Wamego, oh my goodness, it is so punitive that our policy was set up that kids would lose maybe a percentage of a season, but they'd also have to get in some counseling and some help and dealing with stuff in terms of.
To be fair, ours does too. I just couldn't put all that stuff in one slide, but ours has the counseling stuff too. But it also has the you have to sit out from activities for 14 days or 45 days. Let me just respond, if I could, for the give kids a reason to say no. That's exactly why I don't want my kids in a random drug testing school, because I want them to be able to practice the independence, courage, and so forth, to be able to say no on their own merits, not because there's a random drug testing policy, but just because I don't want to. And I worry that, for one thing, what happens to kids after they get out of high school? I'm a parent for life. I'm not a parent for just the 18 years the kid's in school. What happens once they get out of high school, they say, or out of the sports, they say, well, now, geez, Leming, now you can smoke weed now because you're not subject to random drug cure, And so that was my argument against the gives the kids a way out.
Right, and I think that's a valid argument. I certainly understand that, but I was, from my perspective at the time was that, peer pressure being so strong, and not every kid is going to have Tom Vontz as a dad, and to be able to express that strength and to be able to say no. We have kids that show up at parties that just go along to get along, and if we give them one more reason to say no, right, just that, hey, I want to play, I don't want to have to miss the season. I work too hard, and if I get pulled out of class and I got to pee in a cup, I don't. So it gives them an out.
Chris, I get it. I really do. I get it, and for some kids that may be what they need for, like 2 kids. And no, I'm kidding. It could be that could be that way for several kids. Aja, did you want to say something?
I just, I have a problem against it in terms of the student and family privacy, but also I feel that it's a way to start to indoctrinate our kids to be surveillance. Since 9/11, we've increasingly become a country that has been surveyed in so many ways. When you start to get used to being watched and data collected against you, I don't think that's normal. That wasn't how the United States was, I would say, about 20 years ago. And now people just accept it as the norm. And we're increasingly under government surveillance. And so now, if we started in the schools, at the elementary school, because you said your school is 6th to 8th grade, that's really young. They'll get used to it. They'll think it's the norm. And I don't think that's something to be a surveillance, a population that's continuously surveillance is normative. I don't think we should ever accept that. And I find it really problematic.
Thanks, Aja. I wanted to get one speaker in per group, and we're almost at the end. But it doesn't stop there. Constitutional thinking is not just being able to formulate arguments. Constitutional thinking is also being able to act. Before we get to being able to act, Chris, this is Tom's. I happen to write, and by the way, I have about a paragraph that goes along with each one of these that I wrote and sent to the school board, to no avail, by the way. We don't always win as citizens, but Aja, you'll notice that I have bad civics lesson, and basically I made the point that you just made, and
right.
And so the short-sighted thing was about what are they going to do after they get out of school, and anyway, some of these things have actually come to pass. We've had it now. This is our 2nd year of it, and they have been exposed to some costly legal challenges. and I'll get to that in just a second. Chris.
Because I can argue against myself on this too, in terms of like a violation of the Fourth Amendment and adversarial justice system and all that kind of stuff, surrendering your precious bodily fluids to prove your innocence kind of thing. And I think something else to take into account is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but as a teacher, if I believe a kid is under the influence, going back to maybe TLO, is I can refer him to the administration.
It was one of the arguments. It was one of the arguments that we made. It was one of the arguments that they invited the school board association, right, to come and talk to a big group of citizens. And they thought the school board association was going to be pro drug testing. And it was just the opposite. The school board association's attorney came and said, hey, this is a kettle of fish that you don't want to, this is a path you don't want to go down. And you already have lots of tools at your disposal right now. And he mentioned the same thing.
So there is go ahead. No, that's it. That's it.
Okay, I do want to get to a couple other things, and then we'll open it up for questions. So it doesn't stop there just with thinking. It's also action. And Unit 6 is about taking action. What kind of actions could you take? And in fact, both sides, this kind of split the community apart, to be honest with you, as it was being debated. Both sides contacted school board members, contacted school officials. Both sides organized. I went to a meeting down at the coffee shop. Obviously, I was against, and there was probably, 20, 30 people down at the coffee shop saying, we're not going to let this happen, yada, yada. Both sides contacted civil society organizations. We contacted the ACLU. The ACLU did send, by the way, the ACLU, we called them. They came out 2 days later, met us at the coffee shop, got all the facts of the case, came from Kansas City, Bob, and wrote a letter to the superintendent, I still have it, telling the superintendent this is a bad idea, you shouldn't do it, blah, 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 all the stuff that we've already been talking about. And then, of course, both sides exercised other political rights. There were several letters to the editor. I wrote one. The other people wrote letters to the editor. My son happened to be valedictorian. He gave the graduation speech the year that this passed. And I got to be honest, I didn't tell him what to say. I didn't tell him what to do. But this was kind of the talk on the streets, right, in the school. And so he had several not so thinly veiled references to random drug testing, that many of which he was interrupted with applause by the students and at least some parents, while the entire school board and the principal and superintendent are on the stage right behind him. So I was proud of him for standing up. And then I got to show you, the kids did a T-shirt. My son's best friend is Cody Stegman, still is to this day, and he was kind of a leader in the school. And they did tailgating before basketball games, football games, and so forth. And the kids did a T-shirt every year. And so they did this T-shirt. Sorry about that. They did this T-shirt, and Cody was told by the principal that this wasn't going to fly, and he couldn't do this. The kids couldn't wear him to school. They couldn't wear him to any athletic event. Cody reported that to me and some of the other citizens that were against the drug testing policy. We went back to the ACLU, and then the ACLU wrote a letter again to the superintendent, and basically said, don't try to pull this SHIT on these kids. They have free speech rights. And they said that this was obviously a kind of a comedic reference to this policy, but they have political speech rights. And after the letter was sent by the ACLU, magically all the kids could wear those T-shirts. And it wasn't just the kids, it was also parents. And so right after the ban was lifted, we followed along with the ban. All of us did, the parents and students did. But as soon as it was lifted, we went to a football game, and I would say half the crowd was in these red T-shirts, and it was kind of awesome. It's still on the books, by the way, and random drug testing is losing a little steam. Our principal just was non-renewed. The assistant superintendent was non-renewed. And we're sensing a little political weakness, and so we're getting ready to revamp our efforts against it. Okay, last couple things. You can use these ideas not only to perceive, frame, and analyze and judge, but you can also think about these ideas as ways of identifying common problems that we confront as citizenry. So constitutionalism raises the problem of power, right? And who has it, and how do we control it, and all the stuff that Timmy was talking about early on, and that has been really throughout all of the 6 weeks of presentations. Citizenship is the problem of identity. Who are we? Who's in the club? What makes us good? What makes us good citizens? That's been an issue that's been with us from the founding. Human rights, how do we define rights? We have a list of them in the Constitution, but what do they mean as circumstances change? As we develop new methods of surveillance, as Bob pointed out a couple weeks ago, what does that mean in terms of our rights? Representative democracy, this probably receives less attention than it should, in my view, but what's the proper role and scope of government? Just because we have a problem, does it mean necessarily that government should be the solution? And I know that that sounds terribly conservative, but I've said other things that sound terribly liberal, so I hope you're still guessing in terms of what Tommy is. And then finally, civil society. And that's the problem of participation, and how in this country of 300 million people do we encourage people from different backgrounds and different perspectives to come together and participate on behalf of the common good. Couple last things. This comes from 1980. Some of my colleagues might not like it, but I still like it. I still use it. And it points out that we have these fundamental values. This was R. Freeman Butt's list of fundamental values, but it also points out that any of these things taken to an extreme are bad, right? And so, again, finding the middle way, not always, you know, we didn't need the middle way when it came to overturning unjust laws, right? We needed the extreme, but we didn't take it all the way to the extreme of revolution, but we did something extreme, which was civil disobedience. But for the most part, most things, if we went to the moderate middle, the sensible center, we would be in better shape. I've given you some suggested websites. And of course, none of my colleagues thought that I would actually do a list of suggested readings. I did, and they are self-serving because they have at least a couple of things that I helped to work on. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, fellow citizens, that's Tom's 2 cents on why all this matters and why constitutional thinking actually does mean something in our democracy.
Hey, Tommy, great job. We all still, yeah, there you are. Now I can see you. Well, it is, we got 3 minutes. You know, in the name of democracy, I'd love for anyone out there to make a statement. Maybe what do you think of the class? Do you want more or less? You stuck it out, so that's the good news. You know, I always worry that we talk too much and we don't hear enough from our participants. So is there anybody out there who wants to jump in there and say something profound? Well, give me a thumbs up on the class. How about that? Emily, I don't see you giving you a thumbs up.
If you don't mind, just since we got a couple minutes left, I would like to talk to maybe, is it our couple from Indiana, Tom? Yeah, and they've done the face-to-face. They've also done this online. Tom, what did you think of this online version?
Oh yeah, this is I thought it was wonderful. I thought it was great having all these instructors, all these people involved in this. I thought it was, great.
Yeah, to the collective whole here, there's so many wonderful points of view. There's so many, we have diverse backgrounds, so much information that was new and brought into us. Our daughter is, and we the people, we watched her compete at state, and we both looked at each other and said, we don't remember this stuff. We need to learn this stuff again. We need to bone up on this. So not only can we have a discussion with our daughter, but we can also know it and know it. I mean, we're, voters and we do the things, but to really know it. So to be able to get this whole group of highly intelligent individuals, we are so appreciative to have that point of view and that knowledge in one spot. To be able to learn this again. And we're going to start from the beginning of the book and read it all the way through. We're very excited about that. If you guys ever did decide to do maybe a 201 or something, we'd sign up for it in a second. We would absolutely sign up for it.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, on behalf of everybody, Tom and Shane and Chris and Tim and Mark, we appreciate the fact that you were here and participated, and it's always a little sad to say goodbye, if you will, but hopefully you'll fill out that form for Mark Gates so that we can get some of your opinions, because I can tell you that we'll be talking together about what we thought this was a success or not, and whether or not we'll do it again, and possibly we will, and likely in the fall, and we'll do a better job, I think, of recruiting if we do it. And you're certainly welcome to come back, and we'll certainly also discuss some kind of 201, because I think that's kind of the next step. So with that, thanks so much, everybody. Let's wave goodbye.
Yeah, and please click on the survey link.
Get out there and participate in this wonderful country. Fix its problems when necessary. This is our time. We're alive. We can't. It's nice to think about past participants and what they did, but they just set the stage for us to be involved this year and now. So it's not about well, this should get done. We've got to do it, and if we don't, then we leave the next generation even more issues to deal with. So on that note, I'll say goodbye to everybody, and thanks so much for being a part of Constitution 101.